I've driven a taxi for almost 19 years. People like to imagine that the job is exciting, that every night is full of high-speed chases, dangerous strangers, or unbelievable coincidences. The truth is quieter than that. Most nights are built from the same familiar pieces: the soft buzz of streetlights reflected across wet pavement, convenience stores glowing like lonely islands, and tired people carrying grocery bags or suitcases into the back seat without saying much more than an address. A city begins to breathe differently after midnight. You learn its rhythm if you stay awake long enough. You recognize which traffic lights seem to last forever, which apartment windows never go dark, and which roads remain empty no matter the season. That was the world I understood. Then one night my taxi meter started running before anyone opened the door. At first I assumed it was another electrical fault. The cab wasn't new. I'd replaced the alternator twice, repaired the dashboard wiring after floodwater seeped beneath the floorboards, and the digital fare meter occasionally flickered whenever the heater switched on. It wasn't impossible for another small malfunction to appear. I reset the meter. It stopped. 30 seconds later, the numbers began climbing again. 1, 2, 3. No passenger. No luggage. No sound outside except rain sliding down the windshield. I looked into every mirror. The back seat was empty. The sidewalks were empty. The fare reached $6 before it suddenly reset itself to 0. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes strange little mechanical failures feel less frightening if you pretend they're amusing. The next pickup changed everything. A woman in a pale blue coat stood beneath an old bus shelter on Mercer Avenue. She wasn't waiting for a taxi. She simply waited with both hands folded over a weathered leather suitcase that looked decades older than the rest of her clothing. Before I could even slow the car, the meter started again. Not after she reached the curb. Not after she touched the handle. Before. The display lit itself. $1.20. $1.80. $2.40. It was measuring a journey that hadn't begun. The woman looked directly at the glowing numbers through the windshield. Then she smiled. Not warmly. Not threateningly. More like someone relieved that an appointment had finally arrived. She entered the cab without asking if I was available. "You can see it now," she said quietly. I frowned into the mirror. "See what?" "The meter." My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "You noticed? I was hoping you finally would." Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Rain tapped gently against the roof. Traffic lights reflected across puddles like scattered stars. Finally I asked the question that should have come first. "Where are we going?" She hesitated. Then answered with words that have followed me every day since. "Some destinations begin long before anyone gets inside." She gave me an address. I knew every neighborhood in the city. That address didn't exist. Yet my navigation screen calmly calculated the route. Estimated arrival: 37 minutes. Distance: unknown. That was the first night I discovered there were roads hidden inside ordinary roads. And once a driver carries a passenger to one of them, the meter never really stops. The fare that had already begun. I should have refused the trip. Looking back, I can list at least a dozen reasons why any sensible driver would have done exactly that. The address wasn't familiar. The navigation system had somehow accepted it without displaying a district or postal code. Even the estimated route looked wrong. Instead of tracing the city's main roads, the highlighted line drifted through parks, service alleys, and stretches of highway that didn't appear connected. Yet none of those details unsettled me as much as the meter. It kept counting. Normally, the fare climbed according to distance and time. This time it seemed to ignore both. Every few seconds the numbers advanced by small, steady amounts, as though they were measuring something invisible unfolding around us. The woman in the blue coat sat perfectly still. She wasn't looking out the windows. She wasn't watching her phone. She rested both hands on the old leather suitcase, her expression calm enough to make the silence feel intentional rather than awkward. I finally cleared my throat. "So, Do you live there? No. Visiting someone? No. Another pause. Then what is at that address? She considered the question carefully. A place where arrivals matter more than departures. That answer should have annoyed me. Instead, it left me with the strange feeling that she hadn't been avoiding the question at all. She'd answered it as honestly as she could. The city outside gradually became unfamiliar. Not because the buildings changed, but because they seemed older than I remembered. Shop signs that had been replaced years ago appeared freshly painted. A cinema that had been demolished before I started driving stood illuminated with rows of warm yellow bulbs. The sidewalks remained nearly empty, but every now and then I caught sight of people wearing clothes from different decades, walking together without seeming to notice how out of place they looked. When I glanced back a second time, the buildings had returned to normal. I blamed fatigue. Night shifts have a way of convincing your eyes that shadows are moving and reflections are people. I'd worked enough 12-hour evenings to know exhaustion could play tricks on the mind. Still, the navigation had become even stranger. Instead of telling me to turn left or right, the calm electronic voice said, "Continue until the road remembers." I stared at the screen. Then the message disappeared. The map returned as though nothing unusual had happened. "I think my GPS is broken." "No," the woman replied softly. "It's learning." Those two words settled over the cab more heavily than any explanation could have. The rain eased into a fine mist. Streetlights became fewer and farther apart. Without realizing it, I'd driven onto an old riverside road I hadn't used in years. Officially, it still existed. Practically, almost nobody chose it anymore. Newer highways had made it unnecessary. Half a mile ahead stood an abandoned toll plaza. I remembered passing it as a child. The booths had been empty for decades. Tonight, however, every booth was lit. Warm amber lamps glowed behind spotless windows. The barriers were raised. Yet there wasn't another vehicle in sight. As we rolled forward, I noticed something carved into the weathered stone above the central lane. "Every journey has been counted." The words looked impossibly old. Older than the concrete supporting them. Older than the road itself. We passed beneath the sign. The taxi became unusually quiet. Not silent. Quieter than silence. The engine still hummed, but the sound seemed distant, as though I were hearing it through several closed doors. The woman finally spoke again. "Listen carefully." "To what?" "The passengers who almost made this journey." I frowned. Then I heard them. Not voices exactly. More like fragments. Someone laughing. A child asking if they were there yet. An elderly man humming half of a forgotten melody. The clink of coffee cups. A page turning. The tiny sounds of ordinary lives. They drifted around the cab for only a few seconds before fading into the night. "What was that?" "Echoes," she said. "Echoes of what?" "Journeys that ended before they began." I didn't ask another question for several minutes. Part of me didn't want the answer. Eventually the road narrowed until trees enclosed both sides. The city lights disappeared entirely. Ahead I saw a building standing alone beneath enormous cedar trees. It resembled a railway station that had never served trains. A clock tower rose above the entrance. The clock had no numbers. Only 12 small circles carved into white stone. People stood outside beneath wide wooden canopies. There were perhaps 20 of them. None appeared impatient. Some carried suitcases. Others held umbrellas despite the fact that it was no longer raining. A few simply watched the road as though they'd been expecting our taxi all evening. The meter stopped. Not at a round number. It settled on $47.11 exactly. The woman opened her purse. Instead of cash, she placed a small brass token into my hand. It was heavier than any coin I'd ever held. One side showed a winding road beneath 7 stars. The other bore a single sentence. "Paid in full before departure." "I can't accept this," I said. "You already have." Before I could respond, she stepped from the cab. No suitcase. She'd left it behind. I reached for the handle. Ma'am! Your luggage. It's not mine anymore. She walked toward the station without looking back. Several waiting people nodded politely as she joined them. Then, one after another, they entered the building. No doors opened. They simply disappeared into the darkness beneath the archway. When the last figure vanished, the clock tower chimed once. The building's lights went out. My headlights illuminated nothing but an empty clearing. No station. No people. Only cedar trees swaying gently in the wind. I looked into the back seat. The leather suitcase remained exactly where she'd left it. A small paper tag hung from the handle. There was no owner's name. Only 3 handwritten words. For the driver. I didn't open it. Not that night. Instead, I turned the taxi around and started back toward the city. But as I reached the abandoned toll plaza again, I noticed something that made my hands tighten around the steering wheel. Another taxi was waiting beside one of the empty booths. It looked almost identical to mine. Same color. Same company logo. Same dent above the rear wheel. Only one detail was different. Its meter was already running. And behind its steering wheel sat a driver who looked exactly like me. He watched me pass. Then slowly raised one hand in greeting. I never saw his face clearly. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. He recognized me long before I recognized him. And somehow, he seemed disappointed that I kept driving. The suitcase that remembered. I drove home with the suitcase sitting behind me like an unusually patient passenger. Every few minutes I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting it to disappear the way the station had. It never did. The leather was dark with age, cracked around the corners, and polished smooth where countless hands must have carried it over the years. Brass buckles reflected the dashboard lights whenever I turned. By the time I parked outside my apartment, dawn had begun to soften the eastern sky. Normally, after a night shift, I went straight to bed. That morning I couldn't. The suitcase followed me upstairs one slow step at a time, feeling far heavier than it should have. When I finally set it on my kitchen table, the apartment seemed unusually quiet, as though the old building itself were listening. I made coffee. Then another cup. Neither helped steady my thoughts. The brass token lay beside the mug. In daylight it looked even stranger. The road engraved across its surface seemed impossibly detailed, winding between tiny mountains, forests, bridges, and villages that couldn't possibly fit inside a coin barely larger than a bottle cap. Every time I tilted it toward the window, I noticed details I hadn't seen before: a lantern hanging from a roadside tree, a figure standing beside a milestone, a distant lighthouse overlooking the sea. It was as though the token refused to reveal its entire design all at once. Finally, I turned my attention to the suitcase. There wasn't a lock. Only 2 brass clasps. For reasons I still can't explain, I hesitated before opening them. It wasn't fear exactly. It felt more like the hesitation one experiences before opening a letter that might change the rest of one's life. The clasps clicked. Inside, there were no clothes. No valuables. No documents. Instead, the suitcase contained dozens of neatly arranged envelopes. Every envelope was made from thick cream-colored paper. Every one carried a handwritten name. Not addresses. Only names. Some were ordinary. Some sounded old-fashioned. Some belonged to languages I didn't recognize. One envelope had no name at all. Its front simply read, "Reserved for the driver who notices first." My pulse quickened. Beneath the envelopes rested a small notebook bound in faded green cloth. Its pages had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. The first page contained only a single sentence. Every taxi carries passengers. Only a few carry unfinished journeys. I turned another page. It wasn't a diary. It was a handbook. Not the kind issued by a taxi company. This one contained observations collected over decades, perhaps centuries, written by dozens of different hands. Some entries were only a sentence long. Never refuse someone carrying rain on a cloudless night. Another read. Asterisk: if the meter begins before they wave, remain polite. They already know your name, asterisk. Others described places I'd never heard of. The House of Quiet Departures. The Lantern Ferry. The 7th Mile Without Dawn. The bridge that exists only for returning travelers. None of the entries explained where these places were. Only how to behave if you somehow reached them. Hours slipped away unnoticed. The more I read, the less fictional it all seemed. The writers weren't trying to frighten anyone. Their tone was practical. Measured. Almost comforting. Like experienced railway workers leaving instructions for newcomers. By early afternoon I reached the notebook's final pages. Most had been torn out. Only the last remained. Written in darker ink than the rest. Much newer. It said, "If this suitcase reaches you, then the previous driver has completed the final fare. Do not search for them. Do not wait for them. One road cannot keep two keepers forever." There was no signature. Only a date. Yesterday. A knock interrupted my thoughts. 3 slow taps. Not on the apartment door. On the window. I lived on the 4th floor. For several seconds I simply stared. Another 3 taps. I crossed the room cautiously and pulled aside the curtain. An elderly man stood calmly on the fire escape. He wore a charcoal gray coat despite the growing summer heat and held a neatly folded umbrella under one arm. He smiled politely when I opened the window. "You've begun reading." I should have been alarmed that a stranger knew what I was doing. Instead, I found myself asking the obvious question. "How did you get up here?" "The stairs." "There aren't any stairs outside." "There are today." He climbed inside with surprising ease. Everything about him suggested quiet confidence rather than intrusion. He glanced at the open suitcase. "I remember receiving mine." "You've seen one before?" "I've delivered 3. That answer only deepened the mystery. He accepted the cup of coffee I offered without asking for sugar. After a long sip, he nodded approvingly. "Still making it too strong. Drivers usually do." "I've never met you." "No. But others have." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small photograph. It showed 6 taxi drivers standing beside 6 different cabs. The photograph was old enough that its edges had begun curling inward. 5 of the drivers were complete strangers. The 6th was me. Not someone resembling me. Me. Wearing the same jacket I'd worn the previous evening. Standing beside my taxi. Smiling at the camera. I had absolutely no memory of that photograph being taken. "That's impossible." "So it always seems. When was this taken?" He turned the photograph over. Written on the back were 6 dates. The oldest dated back to 1928. The newest was tomorrow. I felt the room become noticeably colder. "Tomorrow hasn't happened." "Not for you." He carefully placed the photograph back into his pocket. "I suppose introductions are overdue." "My name is Elias." "What do you do?" "I supervise routes." "Routes to where?" He smiled faintly. "That depends entirely on what the passengers have forgotten." Before I could ask another question, he stood. "I didn't come to explain everything." "Then why are you here?" "To make sure you don't make the mistake every new driver makes." "And what's that?" He looked toward the suitcase. "They think they're transporting people." He paused. "The passengers are rarely the journey." He stepped back onto the fire escape. The afternoon sunlight should have illuminated the metal stairs. There were none. Only empty air beyond the window. Yet Elias descended calmly, one invisible step at a time, until he disappeared below the edge of the building as though an unseen staircase continued all the way to the street. I rushed to the window. Nothing. No man. No footsteps. No umbrella. Only passing traffic below. When I returned to the kitchen, the unnamed envelope had moved. I was certain it had rested beneath the others. Now it lay alone in the center of the table. Its seal had already been broken. Inside was a single folded card. Written in elegant black ink were 8 words that made my heartbeat quicken more than anything I'd seen since the meter first came alive. "Your next passenger knows about the other driver." Below the sentence was a pickup location. An old taxi stand I hadn't visited in nearly 10 years. And beneath that, a time. 11:47 p.m. Exactly 1 minute before my shift normally began. For the first time since this impossible journey had started, I realized something unsettling. I hadn't been chosen at random. Someone, or something, had been arranging these fares long before I ever noticed the meter. The question was no longer whether I would take the next passenger. It was whether I had ever truly been free to refuse. The stand where no taxi waited for long. The rest of that day passed in the peculiar way time moves after something impossible becomes impossible to ignore. I slept for perhaps 2 hours. The dreams were ordinary, which somehow unsettled me more than nightmares would have. I dreamed about traffic. Broken parking meters. A customer arguing over a fare. Mundane things that belonged to the life I had before the blue-coated woman stepped into my cab. When I woke, the apartment felt different. Not haunted. Occupied. There is a difference. A haunted place demands your attention. An occupied place simply gives you the quiet certainty that you are no longer entirely alone. The suitcase remained on the kitchen table. The envelopes had not moved again. The brass token rested exactly where I had left it, except that the engraved road now seemed longer than I remembered. A tiny crossroads had appeared near its center, branching toward mountains that definitely hadn't been there that morning. I stopped trying to convince myself that my imagination was responsible. Some things insist on being accepted. By 10:30 that evening I was back inside my taxi. The city greeted me with its usual rhythm, office workers catching late rides home, restaurants closing one dining room after another, buses making their final loops before the depots swallowed them until dawn. Everything looked comfortingly normal. Which made me wonder whether normal had always been nothing more than the layer we notice first. At precisely 11:46 p.m., I turned onto Hawthorne Street. The old taxi stand waited beneath an enormous elm tree whose branches stretched across half the road. I'd used the stand regularly years ago before newer pickup zones made it obsolete. There should have been several taxis waiting. Instead, the curb was empty. A weathered wooden bench sat beneath the tree. Its green paint had peeled away decades earlier. An iron clock stood beside it. Its hands pointed to 11:47. Neither hand moved. The second my dashboard clock reached the same minute, my meter awakened. No flicker. No hesitation. The display illuminated with a soft amber glow unlike its ordinary green numbers. 80 cents. $1.10. $1.40. It climbed steadily despite the empty street. Then someone spoke beside my driver's window. "You arrived exactly on time." I hadn't seen anyone approach. An elderly woman stood beside the cab carrying no luggage whatsoever. She wore a dark brown coat buttoned neatly to the collar despite the warm night air. Silver hair rested beneath a simple felt hat. She smiled with the comfortable familiarity of someone greeting a neighbor she'd known for years. "I suppose you're my passenger. For part of the journey." She opened the rear door. Then paused. "No." She closed it again. "Tonight I ride in front." Something about the request felt strangely important. I unlocked the passenger seat. She settled beside me with surprising grace. The cab immediately smelled faintly of cedar wood and old libraries. Not perfume. Memory. She folded her hands in her lap. "Drive west." "No address?" "You'll know when to stop." I laughed quietly. "I've heard that before. I imagine you will hear it often." We pulled away from the abandoned stand. Neither of us spoke for nearly 10 minutes. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It reminded me of driving elderly customers home after medical appointments, people who no longer felt obligated to fill every quiet moment with conversation. Finally, she looked toward the meter. "Does it frighten you?" "A little. It frightened me too." I glanced sideways. "You? Oh, yes. You've been a driver?" She smiled. "No. I was a fare." The words lingered between us. "You remember?" "Every passenger remembers." Then why doesn't anyone talk about it? They do. I've never heard anyone. Because they only remember when they meet someone else who has traveled the same roads. That answer explained nothing. Yet it somehow felt true. We left the city center behind. Warehouses gradually replaced apartment buildings. Railway crossings appeared more frequently. Then, unexpectedly, she asked, "Have you looked inside the envelopes?" "Not yet." "Good." "Why good?" "They aren't letters." "What are they?" She watched passing streetlights drift across the windshield. "They're arrivals." I wanted to ask what that meant. Before I could, the taxi rolled beneath an old stone railway bridge. Everything changed. Not dramatically. Subtly. The road became smoother. The engine quieter. The night deeper. Streetlights now burned with warm golden flames instead of electric bulbs. Telephone poles disappeared. The stars above looked unfamiliar. Not brighter. Arranged differently. My navigation screen displayed no roads at all. Only a simple sentence. "Welcome to the Between Miles." I slowed instinctively. The woman nodded. "Most drivers stop the first time." "What is this place?" "A road maintained by memory." The highway stretched ahead through rolling fields covered in pale silver grass that moved without wind. Small lanterns stood every 100 yards along both shoulders. Each lantern contained a different colored flame. Blue, green, white, amber, crimson. No two were alike. "What are the lights?" "Journeys. They're awfully small." She smiled. "Every journey begins that way." Several miles later we passed another vehicle. An old taxi. Its paint had faded almost to gray. The driver tipped his hat politely as we crossed paths. His passenger appeared to be reading a newspaper whose pages turned by themselves. Neither vehicle slowed. "They can see us?" "Of course." "Who are they?" "Other keepers." The word echoed in my thoughts. Keepers. Not drivers. Not chauffeurs. Something else entirely. Ahead, a roadside building emerged from the darkness. It resembled a service station built sometime during the 1950s. A hand-painted sign swung gently above the entrance. "The last cup before arrival." Several taxis stood outside. None matched the same company. Some looked almost antique. One appeared to have been manufactured before automobiles officially existed. Yet every driver sat quietly drinking coffee on the porch. No one seemed surprised to see another cab arrive. The woman touched my arm gently. "We should stop." Inside, the building smelled of fresh bread, with smoke and rain. An old man behind the counter poured coffee without asking anyone what they wanted. He already knew. The other drivers acknowledged me with small nods but returned to their conversations. No introductions. No curiosity. Only recognition. As though they'd been expecting me for years. The coffee tasted unlike anything I'd ever drunk. Warm. Familiar. Comforting. Like remembering home after forgetting it for decades. The elderly woman noticed my expression. "Every traveler says the same thing." "What is this?" "They call it remembering. It tastes like—" "I know. It tastes like somewhere." She nodded. "Exactly." Near the fireplace hung hundreds of keys. Large iron keys. Tiny brass keys. Silver keys shaped like leaves. Glass keys that somehow reflected no light. "What do they unlock?" I asked the innkeeper. He answered without looking up. "Mostly roads." That sentence settled into my thoughts with remarkable weight. Roads could be locked. Which meant someone had locked them. And someone else had decided who deserved to travel them. When we returned to the taxi, my passenger looked noticeably younger. Not by much. Perhaps 10 years. The lines around her eyes had softened. Her posture had straightened. I wondered if exhaustion was playing tricks again. She noticed me staring. "The closer one comes to where one belongs," she smiled gently, "the less one has to carry." We continued west. The silver fields gradually gave way to enormous forests filled with impossibly tall black pines. Their trunks disappeared upward into mist. The lanterns beside the road became fewer. Finally, only one remained. Its flame burned deep violet. The woman quietly said, "Here." I pulled onto a narrow gravel shoulder. Ahead stood nothing except forest. No houses. No gates. No paths. She thanked me, then opened the passenger door. Before stepping out, she placed something on the dashboard. A small compass. Its needle didn't point north. It pointed somewhere behind us. "The road ahead isn't always the next road," she said softly. "Sometimes the one you're looking for has already passed." She closed the door. Instead of walking into the trees, she simply kept walking forward. The forest accepted her without parting. Her outline faded gently between the trunks until the darkness became whole again. The meter stopped. The final fare displayed wasn't measured in dollars. The screen now showed only 2 words. Fare remembered. The numbers never returned. As I stared at the impossible display, another line slowly appeared beneath it. Keeper registry updated. Before I could process those words, every lantern along the highway extinguished at exactly the same moment. The road ahead vanished into complete darkness. Then, somewhere far beyond the trees, I heard a taxi horn answer another taxi horn. Then another. Then dozens more. Not calling for passengers. Calling to one another. As though every keeper on every forgotten road had just learned my name. The registry beneath the city. The darkness lasted only a few seconds. It felt much longer. When the last violet lantern disappeared, the world outside my windshield became a mirror. I couldn't see the road ahead anymore. Instead, I saw only the reflection of my own face floating in black glass. Then the engine made a sound I had never heard before. Not a cough. Not a stall. It was almost a sigh. The headlights brightened on their own. The blackness retreated. The silver fields were gone. The towering pines had vanished. I found myself parked beneath the same stone railway bridge I'd crossed earlier that night. A freight train thundered overhead. Its wheels screamed against the rails. Ordinary. Loud. Real. My dashboard clock read 1:18 a.m. According to the trip meter, only 23 miles had passed. According to my body, I'd driven for hours. For several minutes I simply sat there. The strange compass rested on the dashboard exactly where the elderly woman had left it. Its needle still refused to point north. Instead, it drifted slowly, almost thoughtfully, before settling toward the southeast. Toward the center of the city. The meter had returned to normal. Or so I believed. The glowing words, "Fare remembered," had disappeared. Only the standard green display remained. I switched the cab off. Started it again. Everything appeared ordinary. Until the radio came alive. Keeper 7 responding. Static. Route 12 remains closed. More static. Registry update acknowledged. Silence. I reached for the tuning knob. No station. Only white noise. Another voice emerged. Driver Elias requests immediate observation. Then nothing. The radio shut itself off. I looked around the empty street. No other cars. No pedestrians. Only the distant rumble of trains disappearing into the night. I had just decided to drive home when the compass needle spun violently. Not quickly. Purposefully. It rotated exactly one full circle before pointing toward a narrow side street I had never noticed before. The name on the street sign had nearly worn away. Only a few letters remained. Larry Lane. Something about the road tugged at my memory. I couldn't remember driving there. But I could remember almost driving there. The sensation was oddly specific. Like recalling a conversation that had happened in another version of the week. I followed the compass. The lane narrowed until brick warehouses crowded both sides. Every building appeared abandoned. Broken windows. Rusted loading docks. Overgrown weeds pushing through cracked pavement. Halfway down the block stood a tiny garage squeezed between 2 larger buildings. Its faded sign read, Merritt and Sons Taxi Repair. The shop should have been condemned decades ago. Instead, warm yellow lights spilled beneath the garage door. I hadn't intended to stop. The taxi did it for me. The engine shut off. The parking brake engaged with a sharp click. The driver's door unlocked itself. A bell chimed inside the garage. Someone had been expecting me. The mechanic looked to be in his late 60s. Heavy work gloves. Oil-stained overalls. Round spectacles balanced near the end of his nose. Without introducing himself, he walked around my taxi once, nodding quietly to himself. "You're overdue. I've never been here. You've been scheduled for years." He crouched beside the front wheel. Ran one hand gently across the tire. Then frowned. "Still running on ordinary roads." I blinked. "I'm sorry?" He looked genuinely surprised. "No one upgraded you?" "Upgraded what?" "The cab." I stared at him. "The taxi is just a taxi." He laughed so suddenly that I almost joined him. "No." He stood. "It's never just a taxi." He opened the driver's door. "Come." The garage interior was much larger than physics should have allowed. Rows upon rows of vehicles stretched into the distance. Not dozens. Hundreds. Every kind of taxi imaginable. Horse-drawn carriages painted with fair numbers. Steam-powered cabs. Elegant black sedans from the 1930s. Bright yellow taxis from cities I'd never visited. Vehicles bearing symbols instead of company logos. Some appeared almost new. Others looked old enough to belong in museums. Mechanics moved quietly between them. None seemed surprised by my arrival. "This," I whispered, "is impossible." The mechanic shrugged. "So are elevators until someone explains cables." That answer reminded me of Elias. Matter of fact. Comfortably impossible. "What is this place?" "The registry garage." "I thought Elias said he supervised routes." "He does." "Then who supervises this?" The mechanic smiled proudly. "We do." He patted the hood of my cab. "Roads change. Drivers change. Passengers change. But someone has to keep the vehicles capable of reaching them." He led me deeper inside. Every section of the enormous garage carried a carved wooden sign. Memory routes. Harbor lines. Mountain passes. Seasonal roads. Dream crossings. Quiet departures. Each mechanic specialized in a different category. Near the back wall stood a taxi unlike any I'd ever seen. Its body appeared carved from dark polished wood instead of metal. Lanterns hung where headlights should have been. The wheels looked impossibly thin. An elderly mechanic gently polished its doors. "Does that one still run?" I asked. "Oh, yes." "When was it built?" He considered the question. "Before wheels." I decided not to ask for clarification. Eventually we stopped beside an enormous wooden cabinet containing thousands of index cards. The mechanic searched for less than a second before pulling one free. He handed it to me. My name was typed across the top. Not just my name. My handwriting. Every address I'd ever lived at. Every taxi company I'd worked for. Every accident. Every traffic ticket. Every passenger complaint. Every commendation. Even the time I'd returned a wallet containing $1,200 15 years earlier. The final line read: Status. Keeper probationary. First confirmed route. The station without numbers. Second confirmed route. Between miles. Pending authorization. Archive roads. I looked up. "Who keeps records like this?" The mechanic answered almost reverently. "The registry." "What exactly is the registry?" He became unusually quiet. After a long pause, he said, "It remembers every completed journey. Even ordinary ones?" "There are no ordinary journeys." Those words settled heavily inside me. For the first time, I began wondering whether every taxi ride I'd ever given had mattered in ways I'd never understood. Had every stranger who climbed into my back seat carried some invisible weight? Some unseen destination? Some unfinished story? The mechanic interrupted my thoughts. There's one more thing. He opened a steel toolbox. Inside lay dozens of taximeters. None looked identical. Some were mechanical. Some digital. One appeared to be made entirely from crystal. He selected a brass-colored meter with unusual care. This belonged to Keeper 42. What happened to them? They retired. People retire from this? Sometimes. And the others? He didn't answer. Instead, he carefully removed my existing fare meter. The replacement fit perfectly. No screws. No wiring. It clicked into place as though it had always belonged there. Immediately the dashboard lights dimmed. The compass needle stopped spinning. The radio whispered for a brief moment. Authorization accepted. Then silence. The mechanic stepped back. There. What changed? You'll stop measuring fares. I frowned. What will it measure now? He looked directly into my eyes. The real cost of the journey. Before I could ask what that meant, every light inside the enormous garage flickered once. Every mechanic stopped working. Every conversation ended. The entire building became silent. Somewhere overhead, a bell rang. Not loudly. Once. The mechanic's expression changed instantly. They've opened an archive road. Is that unusual? They haven't opened one in 27 years. He looked toward the massive garage doors at the far end of the building. Slowly. Very slowly. They began to open by themselves. Cold air flowed inside, carrying the scent of autumn leaves, old paper, and distant rain. Beyond the doors was not another street. It was an avenue lined with impossible trees whose leaves were covered in handwritten words instead of veins. Hundreds of taxis were already pulling onto that silent road. Every driver wore the same expression. Quiet determination. The mechanic placed one hand gently on my shoulder. I hope you enjoy reading. Reading what? He nodded toward the trees. The places people forgot. Outside, the leaves began falling. As each one touched the ground, it transformed into a tiny memory, a child laughing, a wedding song, the smell of bread, a final goodbye, an unanswered apology. The road itself was shedding forgotten lives. And somehow, my taxi had just been invited to drive straight through them. The archive road. The first leaf landed on my windshield without making a sound. It wasn't a leaf anymore. The instant it touched the glass, it became the reflection of a memory. A little girl, no older than 7, sat cross-legged beneath an apple tree, carefully teaching a stray cat how to drink tea from a toy porcelain cup. She laughed every time the cat looked away, convinced it was pretending not to understand. The memory lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then it dissolved back into an ordinary brown leaf and drifted away. Another landed. This one carried the smell of seawater. A fisherman stood at the edge of a weathered pier, removing his wedding ring before slipping it into a small wooden box. His wife had died years earlier, yet every morning he still apologized aloud for coming home alone. Gone. Another leaf. A young violinist playing for an empty train station because she believed music should never wait for an audience. Gone. I sat motionless behind the wheel. The mechanic quietly closed my driver's door. You'll miss the opening. What exactly is this place? The safest dangerous road you'll ever travel. He stepped back. Remember one thing. What? Observe. Not interfere? He nodded. The archive keeps memories. It does not rewrite them. The taxi rolled forward before my foot touched the accelerator. The steering wheel moved gently beneath my hands, guiding us onto the avenue. Immediately the city disappeared behind me. Not gradually. Completely. The garage doors closed with surprising softness. Ahead stretched an endless road lined with immense ash trees. Their silver trunks rose so high that their crowns vanished into drifting mist. Instead of leaves, every branch carried tiny handwritten pages. Millions of them. Some yellowed with age. Some bright white. Some burned around the edges. The pages rustled together with a sound remarkably similar to whispered conversation. Not words. Remembering. The road itself shimmered faintly beneath the headlights. Its surface wasn't asphalt. It resembled polished black stone threaded with thin silver lines that shifted like flowing rivers. Every few hundred yards stood another taxi. None were parked. They drifted slowly forward at exactly the same speed, separated by respectful distances. No one overtook anyone else. No one honked. No one hurried. A journey measured by memory apparently refused to be rushed. The new meter flickered. The familiar dollar sign had vanished. Instead, it displayed a single word: burden. Below it rested an empty horizontal line. As I drove farther beneath the impossible trees, the lines slowly filled with pale blue light. Not quickly. Patiently. "What burden?" I asked aloud. The taxi answered by turning on the radio. "Every traveler carries something unfinished." Static. "The meter measures what remains." Silence. I had begun accepting conversations with my taxi far more easily than I cared to admit. Perhaps that worried me. Perhaps it should have. About a mile ahead, I noticed a man walking beside the road. Not hitchhiking. Simply walking. He wore a long wool coat despite the mild weather. An old camera hung around his neck. Unlike everyone I'd encountered so far, he looked completely lost. He wasn't following the road. He was searching the trees. As I slowed beside him, he smiled with obvious relief. "I was wondering when someone would come." "You've been waiting?" He glanced toward the branches overhead. "I forgot how long." The passenger door unlocked itself. He climbed inside without surprise. The meter chimed once. The blue line beneath burden brightened. Not because he entered. Because he looked out the window. "My name's Arthur," he said. "I think." "You think?" He laughed softly. "I remember my first name. I've misplaced the rest." There was no fear in his voice. Only mild embarrassment. Like someone forgetting where they'd left their umbrella. "You don't know your last name?" "I don't know if I ever had one." He touched the old camera resting in his lap. "I remember this. It still works?" "I've never tried." He looked at me carefully. "You're new. Is it that obvious? You still ask questions." "I suppose that's true. The older keepers stop asking." "Why?" "They've learned every answer becomes another question." We continued along the archive road in companionable silence. Eventually Arthur pointed toward one enormous ash tree whose branches bent lower than the others. "There." I pulled onto the shoulder. He didn't leave immediately. Instead, he handed me the camera. "Would you hold this for a moment?" It weighed almost nothing. He approached the tree. One page drifted gently downward. He caught it before it reached the ground. The instant he unfolded it, he smiled. Not broadly. Not dramatically. Just enough to reveal that something essential had returned. "My surname," he whispered. He looked back toward me. "I remember now." He folded the page carefully. Placed it inside his coat pocket. Then nodded gratefully before walking deeper into the forest of memories. He never looked back. The meter chimed again. The blue burden line emptied. In its place appeared new words. One remembrance returned. The camera remained in my hands. A polite cough came from the back seat. I nearly swerved. No one had been there a moment earlier. A young woman sat quietly behind me wearing a cream-colored cardigan and carrying a stack of library books. She noticed my startled expression. "I've been here since the previous stop." "You?" I looked in every mirror. I would have noticed. Not until Arthur remembered. "What?" She smiled apologetically. "Some passengers can only be seen after another journey finishes." That explanation somehow made perfect sense. Which frightened me more than if it hadn't. She leaned forward slightly. "My destination is the House of Borrowed Afternoons." The compass rotated once. The dashboard map unfolded into roads that hadn't existed before. One route glowed gently. Estimated arrival. When the tea is still warm. No mileage. No time. Only that. I suppose that's normal? It is here. She settled back into her seat. The library books looked unusually old. Each spine carried no title. Only dates. 1912, 1913, 1914, 1915. I frowned. Those years. She nodded. The books aren't organized by subject. They're organized by afternoons. I'm afraid I don't understand. Most people don't. She rested one hand gently on the top volume. Every perfect afternoon someone wishes they could visit again eventually finds a place on the shelves. I felt the hair rise on my arms. You mean memories? Not exactly. What then? She looked out the window where another page drifted from the trees. Possibilities. The distinction lingered in my thoughts long after she stopped speaking. Ahead, the archive road slowly divided into 3 separate lanes. One disappeared beneath autumn-colored trees. Another beneath trees covered in spring blossoms. The third beneath bare winter branches sparkling with frost despite the warm air. The taxi chose the autumn road without waiting for my decision. As we entered it, every fallen page around us transformed. No longer brief reflections. Now they unfolded into entire scenes surrounding the cab. Families sharing meals. Children chasing paper boats through rain-filled gutters. Friends saying goodbye at railway platforms. Letters never mailed. Songs remembered only halfway. The taxi drifted gently through them as though each memory possessed physical weight. None acknowledged our presence. We were observers. Nothing more. I suddenly understood what the mechanic had meant. The archive did not preserve history. It preserved significance. Not every event. Only the moments that quietly shape someone's life forever. The realization filled me with an unexpected sadness. How many of my own quiet moments had already found their way here? How many had I forgotten without realizing they mattered? The road curved gently uphill. At its crest stood a building unlike anything I had seen before. It resembled a vast public library built from pale stone and dark cedar. Every window glowed with afternoon sunlight despite the fact that night still surrounded the road. Above the entrance hung a carved wooden sign. The House of Borrowed Afternoons. People entered carrying empty hands. They emerged smiling gently, as though returning from visits with old friends. Some appeared younger. Some older. One elderly man stepped outside laughing like a child before quietly wiping tears from his eyes. The young woman collected her books. Before opening the door, she looked directly at me. If you ever feel you've forgotten who you are, she smiled warmly, don't come looking for your happiest day. What should I look for? The afternoon that quietly changed everything. She stepped out. The library doors opened before she reached them. Warm golden light spilled across the road. For just an instant, I thought I saw thousands of shelves stretching farther than the horizon itself. Then the doors closed. The building faded gently into mist. The meter glowed once more. This time it displayed no burden. No fare. Only a single line. Keepers are not exempt from the archive. Before I could consider what that warning meant, Arthur's forgotten camera, still resting on the passenger seat, clicked by itself. The flash illuminated the empty back seat. When my vision cleared, a photograph slowly emerged from the camera. It showed my taxi parked beneath the ash trees. The driver's door stood open. The passenger seat was empty. But behind the steering wheel, someone was sitting there. He looked exactly like me, only much older. His hair was completely white. Deep lines crossed his face. And pinned neatly above his pocket was a brass badge engraved with just 2 words. Last Keeper. The keeper who had already finished. For a long time, I simply stared at the photograph. The image should have been impossible. The camera had been resting on the passenger seat. No one had touched it. Yet the print continued developing in my hand, the details growing sharper with every passing second. The older man behind the wheel was unmistakably me. Not merely someone with similar features. The small scar beneath my chin from falling off my bicycle at 13. The slight bend in my left little finger after a poorly healed fracture. Even the faded stitching I'd repaired on the cuff of my driver's jacket. Every detail belonged to me. Only time had changed. Or perhaps something else had. I turned the photograph over. Nothing. No date. No handwriting. Just blank paper. The new meter chimed softly. Not an alarm. More like a patient reminder. The road stretched ahead beneath a canopy of whispering pages. The older version of myself would still be waiting whenever the photograph decided to explain itself. For now, the journey continued. The farther I drove, the quieter the archive became. The drifting memories grew fewer. The trees stood farther apart. Eventually, even the whispered rustling overhead faded into stillness. The silence wasn't empty. It felt respectful. As though the road itself knew it was approaching a place where voices naturally lowered. Ahead, another sign appeared beside the highway. Unlike the others, it had no decorative carvings. Only simple black lettering burned into pale wood. The memories ahead have no living owners. The moment I passed the sign, the temperature inside the cab dropped noticeably. Not cold enough to fog the windows. Just enough that I instinctively reached to adjust the heater. Before my fingers touched the controls, warm air began flowing on its own. The taxi had anticipated me. I thanked it aloud without thinking. The dashboard lights flickered once. Somehow, I had the distinct impression the cab appreciated being thanked. About half a mile later, I noticed a figure sitting alone on a roadside bench. No luggage. No umbrella. No coat despite the growing chill. He looked to be around 12 years old. A boy with neatly combed dark hair and polished black shoes. His hands rested quietly on his knees. He wasn't waiting for me. He was watching the road itself. The meter remained silent. No fare. No burden. Nothing. I slowed anyway. The boy looked toward me and smiled politely. You don't have to stop. I know. Most keepers do. He stood. Walked to the driver's window. His reflection appeared in the glass half a second before he reached it. Almost as though light remembered him before the world did. Can I help you? I was hoping you could answer a question. I'm not sure I know many answers. You know more than yesterday. He glanced toward the photograph resting on the passenger seat. So you've seen him already. You know who that is? I know who everyone becomes. The statement wasn't boastful. It was simply factual. Who are you? I work nearby. Doing what? Cataloging forgotten destinations. He pointed beyond the trees. Only then did I notice a building hidden among them. From the road it resembled a modest railway archive. Gray stone. Copper roof. Tall windows. Nothing remarkable. Until I realized the building had no doors. Only windows. Thousands of them. Every window revealed a different room. Every room contained shelves stretching floor to ceiling. Every shelf held maps. Countless maps. Some looked centuries old. Others appeared freshly printed. One floated gently in midair. Another rearranged itself while I watched. What is that place? The cartographer's house. What does it map? The boy smiled. Places. I gathered that. The difficult places. He seemed amused by my confusion. The roads people stop believing in. I looked again. More carefully. The maps weren't labeled with cities. They carried names unlike any atlas I'd ever seen. The last conversation before forgiveness. Where children misplace imaginary friends. The corner cafe that exists only in retirement dreams. Roadside motel between two regrets. The porch where nobody said goodbye. Each title felt strangely familiar. Not because I'd visited those places. Because I'd almost visited them. The sensation unsettled me. The boy noticed. You're beginning to remember. I've never been here. Not this version of you. I looked at him sharply. What does that mean? Instead of answering, he reached into his pocket. He produced a folded road map. Ordinary paper. Ordinary ink. Except every road upon it slowly shifted position like rivers. He handed it to me. My supervisor wanted you to have this. Who's your supervisor? The chief cartographer. I suppose I'll meet them eventually. You already have. I frowned. When? The boy tilted his head thoughtfully. That depends on which direction you're measuring. Before I could ask another question, he stepped backward. The road shimmered gently. He faded into the surrounding mist without walking away. Not vanished. Filed. Like a page being returned to a book. The moving map occupied the passenger seat beside Arthur's forgotten camera. Neither object seemed eager to explain itself. I had begun accepting that answers arrived only after they became useful. Perhaps that was another rule. The compass suddenly spun. Not wildly. Deliberately. North. South. East. West. Then, straight upward. I frowned. The needle remained fixed toward the sky. A deep bell echoed somewhere above the clouds. Once. Twice. 3 times. Every tree lining the road bowed slightly. Not from wind. From acknowledgement. Something immense had just passed overhead. I couldn't see it. Yet I knew it was there. The radio awakened. Priority route established. Static. Convocation begins at first light. Another burst of static. All active keepers requested. Silence. Convocation. The word lingered. It sounded official. Older than governments. Older than roads. The archive road ended without warning. No gate. No intersection. One moment I was surrounded by impossible trees. The next, I was driving through familiar city streets. Morning commuters crossed intersections carrying coffee. Cyclists waited at traffic lights. Delivery trucks blocked half the lanes as usual. Everything appeared wonderfully ordinary. Except for one detail. No one looked directly at my taxi. Pedestrians glanced toward traffic. Skipped over my cab. Then continued walking. At a red light, a police officer stood only a few feet away. His eyes passed across every vehicle except mine. It was as though the city acknowledged my existence only indirectly. The meter displayed a new message. On duty. The words remained for several seconds before fading. My phone rang. The dispatch office. I answered. Where have you been? My dispatcher asked. I've been working. You disappeared from GPS for 12 hours. 12? I checked the clock. She was right. Nearly noon. It should still have been early morning. We've been trying to reach you all night. I must have lost signal. There was a pause. Then she sighed. Well, a customer wants the driver who found the leather suitcase. My heart skipped. How would anyone know about that? They didn't explain. Where's the pickup? She hesitated. They specifically asked for you. Another pause. They're waiting at St. Barrow Cemetery. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because cemeteries don't usually request taxis. Then she added one final sentence. They said to tell you. Her voice became uncertain, as though she didn't understand the words she was reading. That the registry has finally decided to open your file. The call ended. The phone screen went black. At the exact same moment, the moving road map unfolded by itself. New roads began drawing themselves across the paper. Not with ink. With light. Each glowing line slowly converged toward a single destination. St. Barrow Cemetery. And at the very center of the map, where all the roads met, one location appeared that had not existed before. The Office of Unfinished Arrivals. Beneath the title, in tiny handwritten letters, was a note clearly meant for me. No keeper understands the meter until they witness where every impossible fare is first recorded. I started the engine. The compass pointed steadily ahead. For the first time since the blue-coated woman had entered my cab, I realized I wasn't merely driving passengers anymore. I was being driven towards someone who had been expecting me long before I accepted my first impossible fare. And somehow, deep down, I suspected they already knew exactly how my story would end. The Office of Unfinished Arrivals. St. Barrow's Cemetery sat on the northern edge of the city, separated from the nearest neighborhood by a narrow river and an avenue lined with old chestnut trees. I'd driven past its gates hundreds of times over the years. Never once had anyone asked me to stop there. Most cemeteries are places people leave. Very few are destinations. The afternoon sky had turned pale gray by the time I arrived. The wrought iron entrance stood open, though I could not remember ever seeing it that way before. Moss covered the stone pillars, and the faded letters above them read, St. Barrow Memorial Gardens. Nothing unusual. Nothing supernatural. Just another old cemetery. The compass disagreed. Its needle continued turning beyond the gates. Deeper inside. The meter illuminated. Not with numbers. With a sentence. Please park within the circle of ash trees. I followed a winding lane between weathered gravestones. Some were immaculate. Others leaned gently with age. What struck me most was the silence. Not the silence of death. The silence of waiting. Birds still sang. Leaves still moved. Somewhere, water trickled through an unseen fountain. Yet every sound seemed careful not to disturb something older than itself. Eventually I reached a circular clearing surrounded by 7 enormous ash trees. No graves. No monuments. Only a single stone bench. Someone was already waiting. It wasn't Elias. Nor the mechanic. Nor the blue-coated woman. The figure wore an ordinary charcoal business suit and a long dark overcoat. Their silver hair was tied neatly behind their head. They might have been 60. Or 90. Their face carried the strange timelessness I'd begun noticing among people connected to the hidden roads. As I stepped from the taxi, they smiled politely. You were expected 12 years ago. I stopped walking. I'm sorry. Don't worry. They looked at the sky. Time keeps different appointments depending on the road. You know who I am. I know who you're becoming. I've heard that before. I imagine you have. Their voice carried no mystery. Only quiet certainty. Like someone reading weather reports. I'm called the Registrar. Is that your name? No. Then what is it? I've misplaced the need for one. That answer felt strangely comforting. The Registrar gestured toward the center of the clearing. Only then did I notice a circular pattern carved into the earth. At first I assumed it was decorative stonework. Looking closer, it was made entirely from taximeters. Hundreds of them. Old mechanical meters. Modern digital ones. Brass housings. Steel housings. Glass displays. Each arranged into a perfect spiral leading toward a small opening in the center. None displayed fares. Every one showed a different word. Returned. Completed. Remembered. Forgiven. Delayed. Waiting. The Registrar noticed my fascination. Every keeper eventually leaves theirs behind. When? When they stop measuring distance. And start measuring. They smiled. You'll discover that yourself. The opening at the center of the spiral wasn't a hole. It was a staircase. Stone steps descended beneath the cemetery. The air drifting upwards smelled of cedar, old paper, and fresh rain. 3 scents I'd begun associating with the hidden world. The Registrar started downward. I assume you're coming. I suppose I don't have much choice. You've always had a choice. They looked back kindly. You simply keep making the same one. The staircase seemed impossibly long. Not exhausting. Just patient. Every few landings, another lantern burned inside a niche carved into the wall. Each flame shone a different color. White. Amber. Blue. Green. Violet. Exactly like the lanterns along the between miles. I touched one gently as I passed. Instead of heat, I felt memory. Not my own. Someone else's. An old woman teaching her grandson how to braid rope beside a fishing boat. Gone. The next lantern. A father quietly practicing a speech before attending his daughter's wedding. Gone. Each flame preserved one small human moment. No tragedy. No spectacle. Simply significance. The registrar noticed me slowing. The lanterns burn on gratitude. For what? For moments someone would have mourned losing. At the bottom of the staircase stood an enormous pair of cedar doors. No locks. Only a brass plaque. The Office of Unfinished Arrivals. The registrar opened one door. Warm afternoon sunlight poured through. That was impossible. We had descended underground. Yet beyond the doorway stretched a vast hall filled with soft, golden daylight. The ceiling disappeared into brightness. Shelves rose farther than I could see. Clerks walked quietly between enormous wooden desks. Some carried ledgers. Others carried sealed envelopes identical to those inside my suitcase. No one hurried. No one whispered. Everyone simply worked. The atmosphere reminded me less of a government office than of an old university library. Calm. Purposeful. Peaceful. I expected ghosts. Instead, I found librarians. A young clerk approached carrying a tray. Tea? I accepted automatically. The porcelain cup felt comfortably warm. The tea tasted remarkably familiar. Remembering? I asked. The clerk smiled. No. What then? Beginning. I wasn't sure there was a difference. The registrar led me through aisle after aisle of towering shelves. Instead of books, the shelves contained luggage. Suitcases. Backpacks. Briefcases. Hatboxes. Travel trunks. Wrapped bundles. Thousands. Perhaps millions. Every piece carefully labeled. Everyone waiting. What is all this? Unfinished arrivals. I don't understand. The registrar rested one hand gently on an old leather suitcase. When people begin important journeys, they often leave something behind. Not objects. They leave possibilities. I frowned. What sort of possibilities? The apology never spoken. The letter never mailed. The visit postponed. The dream abandoned because life became busy. The forgiveness delayed until tomorrow. They looked at me. Tomorrow is surprisingly fragile. I walked slowly between the shelves. Some suitcases looked centuries old. Others appeared brand new. Each carried a small handwritten tag. Not names. Intentions. Should have called. One more summer. Return the music box. Learn his recipe. Watch the sunrise together. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Every case represented a life that had expected more time. The registrar stopped before a familiar suitcase. Mine. Or rather, the one the blue-coated woman had left behind. It rested neatly on a cedar shelf. The brass tag had changed. No longer. For the driver. Now it read. Accepted. I thought it belonged to me. It never did. Then why was I given it? So you would understand what you were carrying. The registrar opened the lid. The envelopes remained inside. Except one. The unnamed envelope was gone. You opened yours. I didn't. You did. I remembered finding it already unsealed on my kitchen table. The registrar nodded. It recognized you. We continued deeper into the hall until we reached an enormous circular chamber. Its floor resembled an enormous city map. Roads of polished brass spread outward in every direction. Tiny lights moved along them. Not randomly. Purposefully. Like vehicles traveling through an invisible network. At the exact center stood a magnificent fair meter taller than a grandfather clock. Its brass housing had darkened with centuries of use. Crystal gears turned silently inside. No currency symbols. No numbers. Only one enormous needle moving slowly around a circular face. What does it measure? The registrar's expression became almost reverent. Completion. Completion of what? Journeys. All of them? They nodded. Every meaningful journey. The needle advanced almost imperceptibly. So slowly. It has no reason to hurry. I watched tiny lights travel across the brass roads beneath the glass floor. Some stopped. Some merged. Some disappeared. Others began glowing for the first time. Then I noticed something impossible. One tiny light represented my taxi. I knew it instinctively. Its path glowed brighter than the others. Not because it was important. Because I was watching it. The brass road extended far beyond the edge of the map. Farther than the chamber itself should have allowed. Into darkness. Into somewhere still unfinished. What happens when it reaches the end? I asked quietly. The registrar looked at the distant glow. There isn't one. No end? Only arrivals. Before I could ask another question, every clerk in the vast office stopped working simultaneously. Every lantern brightened. The great meter's needle trembled. A bell rang once. Then again. Then a third time. The registrar closed their eyes. They're here. Who? Instead of answering, they looked upward. Far above us, beyond the bright ceiling, I heard something that sent a chill through me despite the warmth of the hall. Dozens of taxi engines. All arriving together. Not one. Not 10. Hundreds. The sound grew louder with each passing second until it resembled distant thunder rolling across forgotten roads. The clerks began opening drawers. Preparing ledgers. Lighting additional lamps. No panic. Only practiced readiness. The registrar finally spoke. Once every century. They looked directly at me. Every active keeper returns to the office on the same day. I felt my pulse quicken. Why? Their answer came almost as a whisper. Because the first keeper has called for a convocation. The engines overhead fell silent all at once. The entire office held its breath. Then, from somewhere above the ceiling, a single taxi horn sounded. Not loud. Not urgent. Ancient. And every lantern in the office bowed toward its direction, as though acknowledging the arrival of someone every road still remembered. The convocation of keepers. No one rushed toward the sound. That was the first thing I noticed. If the arrival truly belonged to the first keeper, the one every lantern, every clerk, and every hidden road seemed to recognize, then excitement would have been the natural response. Instead, everyone quietly resumed breathing. Pens were placed neatly beside ledgers. Teacups were finished. Jackets were straightened. The office prepared itself with the calm dignity of people welcoming an old friend rather than greeting a legend. The registrar inclined their head. We should not keep them waiting. They led me toward another staircase, this one broad enough for several carriages to climb side by side. The steps curved gently upward, spiraling around the enormous chamber that housed the great fair meter. As we ascended, I realized the walls were not carved from stone. They were made of stacked milestones. Thousands of them. Each bore the name of a road. Some I recognized from the suitcase handbook. Others were entirely unfamiliar. The Lantern Ferry. Winter Mile 9. The Seventh Orchard. Road of Returning Birds. Harbor of Lost Promises. The Quiet Switchback. Every milestone had been worn smooth by countless hands. People touched them as they passed, not for luck, I suspected, but out of gratitude. At the top of the staircase stood a pair of open cedar doors. Beyond them stretched an open courtyard unlike any place I had ever imagined. The sky above was impossible. Not because it held strange stars. Because it held every time of day at once. To the east, dawn painted the clouds in pale gold. Directly overhead rested the calm blue of early afternoon. Far to the west, sunset glowed in quiet amber. Beyond that shimmered deep midnight filled with familiar constellations. None of the horizons argued with one another. They simply coexisted. The courtyard itself resembled an old railway station built around a circular garden. Flowering vines climbed iron columns. Stone benches surrounded a reflecting pool so perfectly still that it mirrored whichever part of the sky someone happened to be looking toward. Drivers arrived from every direction. Some wore modern uniforms. Others dressed in styles belonging to centuries past. A woman in a Victorian traveling coat spoke warmly with a man wearing the reflective vest of a present-day airport taxi service. Neither found the other unusual. Time had apparently become another route to travel. No one carried rank upon their clothing. No medals. No insignia. Only small brass badges pinned above their hearts. Every badge displayed a single number. 7. 42. 312. 9. 101. I searched instinctively for someone wearing number 1. There wasn't one. The registrar noticed. You won't find it. Why not? The first keeper surrendered the badge long ago. Then how do people recognize them? The registrar smiled. No one mistakes sunrise for anything else. A gentle bell echoed through the courtyard. Conversation faded naturally. Not because anyone ordered silence. Because everyone already knew the moment had arrived. The gathered keepers turned toward the far end of the garden. An ordinary taxi rolled slowly into view. It wasn't polished. It wasn't ornate. It looked older than my own, with faded paint and countless carefully repaired scratches. The kind of vehicle that had clearly spent its life working rather than being admired. It stopped beside the reflecting pool. The driver's door opened. An elderly man stepped out. Average height. Gray coat. Weathered cap. Kind eyes. If I had seen him waiting outside an airport, I would have assumed he had simply worked too many night shifts. Nothing about him demanded attention. Yet every keeper quietly removed their cap. Not from obligation. From affection. The first keeper looked around the courtyard with the contented expression of someone checking whether everyone had arrived safely. Only then did I understand. Legends often inspire awe. True guardians inspire relief. He spoke without raising his voice. Every word reached every corner of the courtyard. Good afternoon. 100 voices answered together. Good afternoon. He smiled. It's nice to see you all again. There was gentle laughter. Not ceremonial. Family. The first keeper rested one hand on the roof of his taxi. I hope the roads have been kind. Another ripple of quiet amusement. Then his expression became thoughtful. I realize they rarely are. He began walking slowly around the reflecting pool. No speeches. No declarations. Just conversation. I've received reports that several younger keepers have started believing their task is to transport passengers. A few embarrassed smiles appeared among the crowd. Including mine. He noticed. Of course he did. He nodded toward me almost imperceptibly. You'll discover soon enough. The registrar stepped beside me. Listen carefully. I am. The first keeper never explains anything directly. I've noticed. He doesn't need to. The elderly driver stopped beside the pool. He looked into its perfectly still water. The reflection showed not his own face, but roads. Thousands of roads. Stretching beyond every horizon. He spoke to the reflection. A journey begins before departure. The water changed. Passengers appeared. People boarding buses. Children climbing bicycles. A sailor leaving harbor. A student entering university. A daughter returning home. A journey continues after arrival. The reflections shifted again. Families embracing. Letters being opened. Seeds being planted. Stories being told. Grief becoming memory. Silence becoming forgiveness. Finally he looked up. A keeper's responsibility has never been transportation. He paused. It is continuity. The words settled over the courtyard. Continuity. Not movement. Not distance. Something far quieter. He continued. When roads disappear, someone must remember where they once led. When memories fade, someone must preserve the direction home. When travelers lose faith, someone must continue waiting at the stand. No applause followed. Only understanding. The first keeper looked directly at me. The newest arrival. Every face turned gently in my direction. Not judging. Welcoming. He smiled kindly. Would you join me? My legs carried me forward before nervousness had time to object. Standing beside him felt oddly familiar, as though I'd stood there before. Perhaps in a dream. Perhaps somewhere the archives still remembered. He studied me for a moment. Have you begun listening to your taxi? I think so. It has opinions. I've noticed. Quiet laughter spread among the keepers. The older cabs usually do. He walked toward my taxi, which had somehow arrived in the courtyard without my noticing. He rested one weathered hand upon its hood. Immediately the engine gave a gentle, contented rumble, almost like a cat recognizing its owner. You've been getting acquainted. I suppose we have. He nodded approvingly. A keeper never owns a taxi. He looked affectionately at mine. The taxi decides. He opened the driver's door. Inside, nothing appeared unusual. The dashboard, the seats, the compass, Arthur's camera. Everything exactly where I'd left it. Except the fare meter had changed again. No glowing words. No burden. No registry messages. Instead, engraved into the brass frame itself, letters I was certain had not existed before, were 3 simple lines. Every journey leaves something behind. Every arrival returns something lost. Keep the balance. The first keeper closed the door gently. It remembers you've read them now. I stared. Those weren't there. They were. I looked. You weren't ready. The convocation continued as drivers quietly exchanged journals, maps, photographs, and small brass tokens. No commerce. No payment. Only sharing. One keeper handed another a folded recipe written by a grandmother no longer alive. A woman in an old navy blue uniform carefully returned a child's marble to a driver from another century. Someone laughed after hearing the ending of a story they'd apparently been waiting decades to finish. The hidden world wasn't governed by mystery. It was maintained by kindness. That realization struck me more deeply than any supernatural revelation. As afternoon slowly blended into sunset overhead, the first keeper rang a small handbell. Everyone became still once more. This year's final matter. His voice softened. We have received an invitation. The courtyard grew noticeably quieter. Not fearful. Concerned. The registrar's expression changed. So did Elias, whom I suddenly noticed standing near one of the garden gates. Even the mechanics I'd met in the registry garage had become solemn. An invitation? Someone asked. The first keeper nodded. From beyond the final mile. No one spoke. I leaned toward the registrar. What is the final mile? For the first time since we met. The registrar hesitated. It is the only road no keeper is permitted to drive. I felt a chill despite the warm evening air. If no one drives it. Who sent the invitation? The first keeper slowly unfolded a cream-colored envelope. Its paper looked older than the office itself. Its wax seal bore no emblem. Only a single perfectly drawn circle. He looked around the courtyard. I should warn you. His gentle smile faded only slightly. This is the first letter we've ever received from someone who has already completed every journey. A breeze crossed the courtyard. Every lantern dimmed. Somewhere beyond the impossible horizon, a taxi meter began quietly counting a fare. No passenger had entered. And every keeper in the courtyard turned toward the sound at exactly the same moment. The final mile. No one moved toward the sound. That surprised me. Every keeper in the courtyard had turned toward the distant meter, yet not a single driver reached for their keys or opened a taxi door. Even the mechanics from the registry garage remained where they stood, hands folded quietly before them. The first keeper lowered the unopened envelope. The bell has already answered. I looked around. I didn't hear a bell. You weren't listening for that one. His reply carried no mystery. It was simply the sort of observation an experienced driver might make after noticing rain before anyone else saw the clouds. The meter continued somewhere beyond the horizon. Not quickly. Patiently. Each soft click seemed separated by miles of silence. The registrar stepped beside me. There are 3 roads every keeper eventually learns. I thought there were hundreds. There are. They smiled gently. But only 3 that matter. I waited. The departure. The journey. The arrival. That seems straightforward. It is. They looked toward the impossible horizon. The difficult part is realizing they are rarely the same road. The first keeper finally broke the seal on the envelope. Instead of unfolding a letter, he withdrew a single taxi receipt. No company logo. No address. No fare amount. Only 4 handwritten lines. Pickup, the first goodbye. Destination, the final mile. Passengers, everyone. Status, awaiting driver. A silence settled over the courtyard unlike any I'd experienced before. Not fear. Recognition. One of the older keepers quietly removed his cap and held it against his chest. Another closed her eyes for several moments. Someone near the back whispered, "So it has begun." I leaned toward Elias. "What has begun?" He answered without taking his eyes from the receipt. "The question every keeper eventually receives." The first keeper folded the paper carefully. "There is no emergency." A few relieved smiles appeared. "There is no crisis." More shoulders relaxed. "There is only a journey." He looked around the gathering. "And every journey deserves a driver." No volunteers stepped forward. Not because anyone lacked courage. Because they understood something I did not. The first keeper noticed my confusion. "You think we're deciding who must leave, aren't you?" He shook his head. "We're deciding who is ready to return." Return. The word lingered strangely. Return where? Return to what? I suddenly remembered Arthur's camera. The photograph of my older self. The brass badge. Last keeper. A possibility I had quietly avoided finally forced itself into my thoughts. What happens to a keeper when every road has been driven? The first keeper smiled. They stop counting distance. And then? They become part of the road that guided them. The courtyard fell quiet once more. The reflecting pool rippled for the first time since I'd arrived. Not from wind. From footsteps. Someone was approaching. Yet no one could be seen. Only gentle circles spreading across perfectly still water. The first keeper inclined his head respectfully. "They've arrived." "Who?" Instead of answering, he stepped aside. The air itself shimmered. A woman gradually appeared beside the reflecting pool. Not materializing. Remembering. As though reality had simply recognized she belonged there. My breath caught. The pale blue coat. The weathered leather suitcase. The calm smile. The first impossible passenger. She looked exactly as she had the night my meter awakened. Except now I noticed something I had overlooked before. She wore a small brass badge. No number. Only a simple road engraved upon it. She smiled warmly. "You've been keeping busy. I've been looking for answers." "I know. Who are you?" She looked toward the first keeper. He nodded once. "Permission." She turned back to me. "I was your predecessor." The words landed with unexpected gentleness. "I don't understand. You weren't the first driver of your taxi." "I assumed that." "No." She smiled. "I mean exactly your taxi." She rested one hand lovingly upon its roof. "It remembers everyone." The engine hummed softly beneath her fingertips. Like greeting an old friend. "My name was Clara." "Was?" She laughed quietly. "You'll discover names become less important. You left me the suitcase. I inherited it. And before you? Another keeper." "How far back?" She glanced toward the horizon. "Farther than roads." The first keeper addressed everyone gathered. "The invitation requires no decision today." Quiet relief passed through the courtyard. "It asks only one question." He looked directly at Clara. Then at me. Then finally toward every keeper present. "When the final mile opens, who will remember the beginning?" No one answered. Not because no one knew. Because every keeper understood the answer carried a responsibility rather than an opinion. Clara gestured toward the garden path. Walk with me. We left the courtyard together. No one tried to follow. The path wound through flowering trees whose blossoms drifted upward instead of falling. The impossible sky slowly shifted from sunset toward evening. You've been wondering why the meter starts before certain passengers enter. I have. It's the question everyone asks first. And the answer? She stopped beside a small stone bridge crossing a narrow stream. The water reflected not the sky, but moving roads. The meter never measured passengers. I've begun to suspect that. It measures journeys. She looked into the flowing reflections. Some journeys begin with a conversation. Some begin with grief. Some begin years before two people ever meet. She looked at me kindly. When someone approaches your taxi carrying a journey that has already begun, the meter simply notices before you do. Everything became very still. I looked back over every impossible fare. The blue-coated woman. Arthur. The elderly passenger. The young librarian. None of them had started their journey when they entered my cab. They had already been traveling long before I arrived. I had merely become part of their path. So why me? I asked quietly. Why was I chosen? Clara smiled with unmistakable affection. You still think you were. She reached into her coat pocket. From it she withdrew an old newspaper clipping. Yellow with age. She handed it to me. The article described a traffic accident nearly 20 years earlier. A bridge. Heavy rain. One taxi. A family of 3 rescued from a flooded river. My hands began trembling. I remembered the accident. Barely. It had happened during my 2nd year as a driver. The rescue had received almost no publicity. I'd never thought much about it afterward. You remember? Of course. You believed you chose to stop. I did. Clara gently shook her head. No. She pointed toward the article. Read the time. 11:47 p.m. Exactly 1 minute before my shift had officially begun. The same minute written inside the unnamed envelope. The same minute I had first visited the abandoned taxi stand. The meter started that night too. I looked at her in disbelief. I never noticed. You weren't ready. She folded the newspaper carefully. The registry did. A realization spread slowly through me. Not shocking. Quiet. Like dawn. I had not been selected because of a mysterious destiny. I had become visible because, years earlier, I had interrupted my own ordinary route to help strangers without expecting recognition. The hidden roads had simply remembered. Clara looked toward the distant courtyard where the first keeper still stood beside the reflecting pool. Kindness is how every keeper is first discovered. No examinations. No invitations. No secret organizations recruiting drivers. Only one quiet decision made when nobody important is watching. She smiled. The roads pay attention. The stream beneath the bridge suddenly changed. Instead of roads, I saw my own reflection. Older. Hair silver. The same calm eyes from Arthur's photograph. The brass badge. Last keeper. This time the reflection looked directly at me. He didn't speak. He simply raised one hand. Not in warning. In greeting. Then the water flowed normally once more. Clara placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. He's not your future. I looked at her. Then who is he? She answered with a sentence that seemed impossible and inevitable at the same time. He's the version of you who finally understands that every road has been leading to the same passenger. Before I could ask who that passenger was, every lantern in the garden extinguished simultaneously. The impossible sky dimmed. Somewhere beyond the walls of the office, a taxi door opened. Then came the unmistakable sound of someone settling into the back seat. No footsteps. No conversation. Only the soft click of a closing door. My meter awakened. For the first time since I had become a keeper. It displayed not a fare. Not a burden. Not a destination. Only a passenger count. The passenger beyond the final mile. The words remained on the meter long after I expected them to disappear. The final passenger has entered. No destination followed. No route appeared on the dashboard. The compass, which had guided me faithfully through every impossible journey, slowly spun once before coming to rest without pointing anywhere at all. It was the first time I had ever seen it admit uncertainty. Clara looked toward the taxi with an expression I could not quite read. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was the quiet respect one offers a moment that has waited a very long time to arrive. "You should go," she said. "I don't know where. You've never truly known." I smiled despite myself. "I suppose that's becoming a pattern." She returned the smile. "The road always introduces itself." The courtyard had become almost perfectly silent. The gathered keepers stood in 2 long rows stretching from the reflecting pool to my waiting taxi. No ceremony had been announced. No one instructed them where to stand. They simply knew. As I walked between them, each keeper inclined their head, not to me, I realized, but to the unseen passenger already waiting inside the cab. The first keeper stood beside the driver's door. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew a small brass key. Unlike every other key I had seen hanging in the registry garage, this one carried no teeth. It was perfectly smooth. "What does it unlock?" He closed my hand around it. "It reminds." "Of what?" "That every door worth opening was never really locked." Before I could ask him what that meant, he opened the driver's door. "Drive carefully." "I always do." "I know." He smiled. "That's why you're here." The seat felt exactly as it always had. Comfortably worn. Familiar. The steering wheel rested lightly beneath my hands. Yet the taxi itself felt older. Not weaker. Wiser. Like a friend who had been quietly waiting for me to catch up. I looked into the rearview mirror. The passenger sat in the darkness of the back seat. I could see only the outline of a long coat and folded hands. No face. No features. Just a patient presence. "Good evening," I said. A calm voice answered. "Good evening." The voice sounded strangely familiar. Not because I recognized it. Because it reminded me of home. Not a particular place. The feeling. "Where are we going?" The passenger answered gently. "Where every keeper eventually begins." The meter chimed once. The engine started without my turning the key. Ahead, the gates of the courtyard opened. Beyond them lay a road I had never seen. No milestones. No lanterns. No maps. Only a quiet ribbon of pale stone disappearing beneath a sky filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. The dashboard displayed a single destination. The final mile. The road was unlike any other. There were no intersections. No signs. No bends. Yet it never felt endless. Instead, it possessed the peaceful certainty of a path that had always known exactly where it belonged. The stars overhead reflected upon its surface until I could no longer tell whether I was driving beneath the sky or across it. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Eventually the passenger broke the silence. "You've been wondering why the roads exist." "I have." "They exist because people forget." "Forget what?" "That no one travels alone." The answer settled quietly into the cab. I thought about every fare I'd ever accepted. The lonely office worker. The elderly widow visiting her husband's grave. The nervous student on the way to an interview. The exhausted nurse heading home after dawn. Every one of them had believed they were making an ordinary trip. Perhaps none of them truly had. The stars slowly changed. Not position. Meaning. I began recognizing them. One resembled the curve of a bridge where I'd learned to ride a bicycle. Another mirrored the street lamp outside my childhood home. A cluster of lights formed the outline of my father's old toolbox. They were not constellations. They were memories arranged into navigation. The passenger noticed me watching. Every traveler leaves the universe a way to remember them. Far ahead, something emerged from the darkness. At first I thought it was another taxi. As we drew closer, I realized it was an old wooden bench standing beside the road. Nothing more. No shelter. No sign. Only a bench. Someone sat waiting. The older version of myself from Arthur's photograph. White hair. Gentle eyes. The brass badge engraved. Last keeper. He rose as my taxi approached. I stopped beside him. For several moments we simply looked at one another. There was no shock. No impossible revelation. Only familiarity. Like meeting a brother after many years apart. He smiled first. You've taken your time. I suppose I have. You always do. He glanced toward the rear seat. Have they told you yet? Told me what? He laughed softly. They never do. The rear passenger finally opened the door. For the first time. They stepped into the starlight. I expected a stranger. I expected something ancient. Instead, I saw an ordinary taxi driver. Middle-aged. Kind eyes. A weather jacket. Hands marked by years of gripping a steering wheel. He wore no badge. No uniform. Only a quiet smile. The older version of myself greeted him warmly. It's good to see you again. The driver nodded. And you? I looked between them. I don't understand. The older keeper faced me. You've been asking the wrong question. I thought the mystery was why the meter starts before certain passengers enter. It isn't. He pointed gently toward the quiet driver. The mystery is why some drivers notice. The ordinary driver looked at me. My shift ended a very long time ago. You were the first keeper? He smiled. I was simply the first one who stopped for someone without asking where they were going. The words echoed inside me. No prophecy. No destiny. No chosen bloodline. Just one quiet act of kindness on a forgotten road. Others had followed. Road after road. Keeper after keeper. The hidden network had grown not from power, but from compassion repeated often enough that the universe itself began remembering. The first keeper, if that title even mattered anymore, looked toward the endless road stretching ahead. There will always be travelers. There will always be departures. There will always be unfinished arrivals. He smiled. So there will always be keepers. He turned back toward me. The final mile isn't the end. What is it? The place where every keeper remembers. He looked toward the stars. That they were once ordinary people who simply chose to stop. The meter chimed one final time. Its display cleared completely. Then new words appeared. Not for the passenger. For me. The journey was always yours. The quiet driver stepped back into the darkness beyond the bench. The older keeper did the same. One by one, they faded into the starlight, not disappearing, but becoming part of the road itself, like milestones too old to separate from the path they marked. The bench remained empty. Waiting. I looked into the rearview mirror. The passenger seat behind me was vacant. At some point during our conversation, the final passenger had quietly arrived. I had never noticed them leave. The meter gave one last gentle click. It did not reset to zero. It simply went dark. For the first time since the blue-coated woman had entered my taxi, there was nothing left to measure. Ahead, dawn slowly appeared at the end of the final mile. I placed the taxi into gear. Without hurry. Without uncertainty. And I drove toward the light, understanding at last that every impossible fare, every forgotten road, every hidden office and quiet keeper had existed for one simple purpose. To make sure that no meaningful journey, however ordinary it seemed, was ever truly made alone. Dawn found me back in the city. There was no dramatic return. No blinding light. No sudden awakening that revealed everything had been a dream. One moment the final mile stretched beneath my tires like a ribbon of quiet stars. The next, I was waiting at a familiar red light 3 blocks from the river, listening to a cyclist's whistle, while a bakery opened for the morning rush. Everything looked ordinary. For the first time in weeks, I understood that ordinary was not the opposite of extraordinary. It was simply where the extraordinary preferred to hide. The taxi's dashboard had returned to its familiar arrangement. The compass rested quietly in its bracket. Arthur's camera remained on the passenger seat. The brass key from the first keeper hung beside my ignition. The meter, however, had changed forever. There were no glowing messages. No mysterious words. No impossible fares. Only the familiar green display. For almost an hour I drove through the waking city without receiving a single passenger. I found that strangely comforting. The roads, it seemed, were allowing me time to think. Around 7 o'clock, dispatch finally called. "Morning," the dispatcher said cheerfully. "You vanished again." "I've been working." She laughed. "You always say that." "I always mean it." "Well, someone's requesting you specifically." "Where?" "The train station." "Name?" "They didn't leave one." I smiled. Of course they hadn't. The station bustled with commuters. Business travelers hurried toward platforms. Families embraced before long journeys. Children dragged oversized backpacks across polished floors. No one looked particularly remarkable. Yet now I could see it. Journeys. Not destinations. Every face carried one. A teenager nervously rehearsing an apology. An elderly man holding flowers with trembling hands. A woman smiling at a letter she had not yet opened. Invisible roads stretched around them like threads of light. Not magic. Meaning. Most would never know those roads existed. They didn't need to. A young father approached my taxi carrying a sleeping child. His wife followed behind with 2 worn suitcases. The little girl stirred just enough to wrap her arms more tightly around her father's shoulder before falling asleep again. The meter remained dark. Ordinary fare. Ordinary family. Ordinary morning. He settled into the back seat. "Airport, please." As I pulled away from the curb, he quietly asked, "Do you mind if we stop somewhere first?" "Of course. My daughter wants to wave goodbye to her grandmother's house." I glanced into the mirror. The child never woke. She simply smiled in her sleep. The meter clicked. Once. Not visibly. I heard it. Softly. Almost affectionately. The journey had already begun. We stopped outside a small brick house on a quiet residential street. The father gently lowered the window. The little girl opened her eyes. Still half asleep. She looked toward the front porch where an elderly woman stood wrapped in a knitted shawl. Neither spoke. The grandmother simply raised one hand. The child waved back. Then smiled. A smile so complete that it seemed to settle something neither of them could have explained. "We can go now," the father whispered. As I pulled away, I caught one final glimpse of the grandmother. She wasn't watching the departing taxi. She was watching the road. As though thanking it. I never learned their names. I never discovered whether they moved across the country or merely across town. I don't know whether the little girl remembered that final wave years later. She probably wouldn't. Memory has always been selective. The roads remember for us. Weeks became months. Months became years. The impossible fares never stopped. Neither did the ordinary ones. Some evenings I carried accountants home after overtime. Other nights I drove musicians, nurses, students, tourists, widowers, newlyweds, gardeners, teachers, and people who simply needed someone to listen while the city slipped quietly past the windows. Not every passenger belonged to the hidden roads. Most didn't. That no longer mattered. Because every passenger belonged to a journey. And I had finally learned the difference. I visited the office of unfinished arrivals many times. Sometimes to return an envelope. Sometimes to leave behind a suitcase that no longer needed carrying. Arthur eventually remembered every part of his name, and became one of the archive's cartographers. The elderly woman who had introduced me to the Between Miles continued borrowing quiet afternoons from the great library. Elias never stopped supervising routes, though I eventually discovered he intentionally took the longest possible way to every destination because, as he once admitted with a rare smile, interesting things rarely happen on shortcuts. The mechanic in the registry garage continued repairing taxis that had driven farther than maps could admit. Every visit, he insisted my cab was finally beginning to sound experienced. I chose not to ask what that meant. Years passed gently. The city changed. Buildings disappeared. New bridges replaced old ones. Entire neighborhoods transformed. Yet every so often I would discover a narrow street I could have sworn had never existed before. Or notice a weathered bench standing beneath an elm tree exactly where someone happened to need a place to wait. The hidden roads were not separate from the world. They quietly repaired it. One remembered journey at a time. People often ask taxi drivers whether we've met anyone famous. I always smile. I've carried actors, scientists, authors, mayors, musicians, athletes. They were interesting enough. But they are not the passengers I remember. I remember the widower who finally decided to adopt the stray dog waiting outside his apartment. The exhausted medical student who realized halfway home that she still wanted to become a doctor after all. The little boy who spent an entire ride explaining why clouds should have names. The elderly sisters who laughed so hard at an old family joke that I found myself laughing too despite never hearing the beginning. The roads remember those journeys too. Perhaps especially those. Sometimes, very late at night, I still hear another taxi horn somewhere beyond the city. I answer with one brief tap of my own. Not because anyone expects it. Because somewhere another keeper is driving a passenger whose journey began long before either of them realized. The sound reminds them they are not alone. Just as it reminds me. I no longer wonder why the meter starts before certain passengers enter. I know. Journeys are patient. People simply notice them at different times. And if, someday, you climb into a taxi after making a difficult decision, after finally saying goodbye, after choosing forgiveness, after deciding to return home, don't be surprised if the driver smiles before asking where you're going. The road may have already told them. And somewhere, beneath the quiet rhythm of the engine, an old meter may already be counting a journey that began long before you opened the door. The receipt nobody claimed. Several years after my first impossible fare, I was helping the clerks reorganize a neglected corner of the office of unfinished arrivals. Dust covered the highest shelves. Most of the suitcases there had not been opened in generations. Hidden behind a stack of weathered ledgers, I discovered a thin cedar drawer I had never noticed before. It contained no luggage. Only receipts. Thousands of them. Every impossible fare ever recorded. Each printed on the same cream-colored paper. Each carefully filed. Curious, I searched for my first journey with Clara. It was exactly where it should have been. The pickup location. The destination. The registry seal. Everything perfectly ordinary by impossible standards. Then I noticed something that made me stop breathing. At the very bottom of the receipt, in handwriting rather than print, was a note. I was certain it had not been there before. It read, "Driver requested by passenger." Beneath it, another line. "Passenger requested by road." And beneath that, a final sentence. Written in older ink than the paper itself should have been capable of holding. Journey approved long before either was born. I carried the receipt to the registrar. Without reading it, they smiled. "You found one of the original annotations. What does it mean?" The registrar looked toward the endless shelves of suitcases. "The roads occasionally make introductions. Between strangers? They are rarely strangers." I frowned. "I still don't understand." "No." They nodded gently. "Neither do we." That answer should have frustrated me. Instead, it filled me with an unexpected peace. Some mysteries, I had learned, do not exist to be solved. They exist so that kindness continues without demanding certainty in return. Even now, on certain quiet nights, I glance at my fare meter before a passenger reaches the door. Most of the time, it sleeps peacefully. But every once in a while, just before someone places a hand on the handle, the numbers awaken. Not because the trip has begun. Because somewhere, long before that moment, a road remembered that two journeys were finally about to meet. And after everything I have seen, I always unlock the door.